Hi, this is Lamar, and you're listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. A third space is a term that refers to a safe space for people to come together for respectful dialogue in a spirit of listening, sharing, and learning. In this podcast, we explore what it means to have third space conversations, and we try to model them. If you like what you hear in this podcast, please be sure to subscribe, share it, and of course, like it. The more people join us, the quicker we get to third space as a society. Now let's get to third space today.
Hey, Lamar, how's it going today?
Oh, Tom, it is going well. It's been a gorgeous week here in Kansas.
Oh, well, I'm glad somebody had a gorgeous week.
You got rained on, didn't you?
Oh, my goodness, have we gotten rain. We have gotten lots of rain recently, and even some flooding out in western Maryland. So at the time we're recording this, and now, of course, this is coming out in early June, but we're recording this in the middle of May, almost exactly the middle of May. And we are just coming off of a week that's been very, very wet out here. And yeah.
Well, this is Kansas where I'm at. And right now, many of the ponds are full, and that's great. But we are just getting into the summer season. And so we are a state that we need all the water we can get in the spring to get us through the summer.
Yeah. There you go.
It can be very dry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I've really been looking forward to this particular podcast because we're having a person on who is a faithful listener.
Yes.
And with expertise that is unique, at least for us, because we're a long ways off the farm. But this guy is a farmer in Kansas and has his finger on the pulse of farming today, and he's a good friend of yours.
He is a good friend of mine. His name is Allen Schrag, and he owns and operates Silver Creek Farm, which is just a couple of miles south of me. I often will reference the farmer south to me, and this is Allen and his son Paul, who operate the family farm. So I'm thrilled to have Allen with us, and he is a regular listener. And a couple of episodes ago, you and I made a comment about the '80s farm crisis.
Yeah,
and he had a comment back to us, and I had a chance to talk with him just briefly about it. And I said, "Hey, why don't you join us, and we'll talk about what went on in the '80s in the agricultural world, and we'll talk a little bit about what's going on now and where things are headed." So, I think it's going to be a fun and interesting time to chat with Allen.
Yeah, and it might be helpful for folks listening in who are not Allen,
yes,
to know that we're talking about the farm crisis of the '80s for a couple reasons. One is that this is a period that all three of us lived through. Myself and Lamar, we grew up on family farms in Iowa. And Allen lived through that as well in Kansas. But it was a really, really difficult time for farmers.
It was.
And there were a lot of farmers that went bankrupt. There were a lot of farmers who went completely out of business. They lost their farms. Century farms, farms that had been around for over 100 years, went out of business as well. And recently, with all the tariffs and everything that's been happening in our federal government and in dealing with other countries, we've wondered if there's possibility that we might end up in a similar situation for farmers with what is going on. So that's inspired us to a certain degree. Anything else inspired us along that line that you can think of, Lamar?
Well, I think that I live in a farming community, and I see it every day, and I hear it every day. And when I go to my coffees that I talk about, we talk about farming, and we're always wondering, or someone's always wondering, well, how much rain did you get? And all of that in my life is not as relevant as it is in the agriculture community. And so, I think it kind of is a nice way to get a perspective of what's going on around me and around us. In addition to that, all these things that we are hearing about this administration and previous administrations' relationships in the world economy, I don't think we fully appreciate the impact that has on the agricultural community.
Yeah.
And so I think Allen will have an opportunity to address that as well.
You know what, Lamar? You just said something that made me reflect and realize that for the first time in many, many, many years, I live back in an agricultural area.
Okay. You have just moved, yes.
Yeah, I live in Frederick County, Maryland, which is, I believe, if I remember and understand this correctly, it has more farms than any other county in the state active working farms. We have a huge dairy industry here in Frederick County. And because you go west of here and you begin to get into the Appalachian Mountains, and east of here, it's very urban. We're sitting 45 minutes from Baltimore, 45 minutes from Washington, D.C. But there's certainly a different feel here. It feels more rural than where we lived before, about an hour east of here. So,
you've mentioned that before.
Yeah,
and I think that the values, the lifestyle, the pace of life, is different.
It is different.
You get into those, right.
It is different. Plus, we have a professional basketball team that is inspired by the name is inspired by the rural area in which we live. They are the Frederick Flying Cows. There you go. And they're actually pretty
ridiculous. Good.
Yeah. Well, so I suppose it's probably time for us to open the green door.
Yeah.
All right, the green door.
Let's get Allen out of there.
Why do we keep talking about the green door? I
don't know. It's a green room.
It's a green room.
Door
we need to open the door to the green room and let Allen in.
And have you been oiling that thing?
No, I keep forgetting to, man.
All right.
It's a little creaky. What can I do?
Okay.
All right.
Well, let's get Allen in here.
All right. Sounds great. Welcome, Allen. How was the green room?
Well, I've heard about the green room. I'm a regular listener of the podcast. I had no idea that it was so well stocked. I mean, there was anything that any person could ever want in there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Well, Lamar's usually in charge of the gift basket in there.
I think I may have hit the order button like 2 or 3 times because I didn't think it was going through. Well, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast. So let's do some disclosure and some introductions. Allen, it is great to have you on the podcast. I have the privilege of interacting with you a lot more than Tom does. But you are a farmer here in Kansas, and you're not far down the road. You're just a couple of fields to my south from where I live. In fact, I might have heard your dog bark last night at the coyotes.
Probably.
Yeah, it's okay. But let's do some full disclosure here. I've known Allen for a number of years. I met Allen actually when I was working at Hesston College, and his son was a student at Hesston College, and did well, by the way. So it's not a problem type of a situation. It's a small college, and we all get to know each other really well. Your son Paul is now working with you on the farm, and which we're going to be doing some talking about a little bit. And today's podcast, the reason we invited Allen on, I sent Allen a note after he sent me a note about farming, and I said, I think we need to have you on the podcast. And there was this silence for, I don't know, it might have been an hour or two before I heard back from him that, okay, maybe this is a possibility. Would that be right, Allen, when I ask
probably
you?
4 or 5 hours.
Yeah. but no, you had picked up something that Tom and I had just mentioned in a previous podcast about the farm crisis of the 1980s, and you made a comment to me about it, and I thought, wow, that this could be a fascinating conversation. So, thank you for joining us, and we want to talk about the 80s. We want to talk about what's going on in farming now, and we also want to talk a little bit about some of the interesting projects you and your son Paul are getting into with your farm is Silver Creek Farms, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of your history in the area and farming, and just give us kind of a ballpark about how you got into farming and what keeps you involved.
Sure. Thank you. Glad to be here. Grew up on a farm, actually a little further south of where I currently live. And it became apparent to me fairly early on that Dad and Mom went through the Depression, and that farm wasn't going to be big enough for me to join. And so, through a series of very interesting events, I ended up being a partner in a local feed business. And me and my partner grew that business for almost 30 years. By the time we sold it, we were in 15 states, and the business was actually offered to my partner. And he was 15 years my senior. And when he came to retirement age, he said, Alan, I want to retire. And it didn't take us long to realize that it was worth much more as a whole than a half. So we ended up selling it. Well, it took me 18 months to figure out what they wanted to do. It took me another 18 months to figure out that probably wasn't a fit for my personality. And then we started working at putting together a full-time farm. So to back up, grew up on the farm, farmed with my dad as a hobby farm while we had the feed business. And then Dad retired and I continued, and it was purely a hobby farm. So the 80s did not affect us personally. It affected neighbors, friends, everybody. And so I've always been actively farming. We started farming full-time in the mid-2000s, and then Paul joined us in 2017, and the rest is history.
I think what is interesting, Alan, is that you have a very unique perspective in that you were in an agribusiness during the 80s, and you saw this happening probably with the farmers that you were working with. Even though you weren't experiencing it personally, you certainly were there for the collateral effects.
Yeah.
And you saw this happening with your friends and neighbors, I'm guessing. Is that customers. A correct assumption? And customers. Yeah.
So from your from that seat, can you kind of explain what you were seeing here in Kansas? And actually your customers were all over the Midwest, right?
Correct.
Because you were in several states. So can you, from that seat, can you talk a little bit about what you were seeing, and even as an agribusiness, kind of how you had to handle that or deal with those constituents?
Well, as far as how we had to handle it, here in the Midwest, things are pretty casual. Most business is done on handshake, and they ask for a product, you deliver it, and you get paid. So what happened in the 80s to us was, as the financial stress came on, then accounts receivable went from slow to not a lot. Kansas farmers are probably a little more fiscally conservative, but we had our share of bankruptcies too.
I think it might be good for us to take a moment here and talk a little bit about what we've learned happened. during the 1980s. That's called the farm crisis.
So
is that something you could speak to from your perspective,
yeah,
Alan?
let me give you my perspective, and this will be different than anybody else's because that's who I am. But the 80s actually started in the 70s with the Russian wheat deal.
Yep.
And the Russian wheat deal was a huge deal for us in Kansas because wheat went from a low of $1.15, I think was the low in the 70s, peaked at $4. That changes everything. And so when your income doubles or more, then farmers just can't sit on their income. Then we have to expand, we upgrade equipment, yada, yada, yada. And we rocked along with pretty decent. While the Russian wheat deal didn't really work out the way it expected, it put us at a different level on grain prices for a long period of time. And so we went along with good grain prices. We expanded our farms. We purchased land. We incurred more debt. Interest was relatively cheap, and this is going to be an interesting conversation, but interest was around 7%. My children have mortgages in the 2s and 3s, and they wonder how us old people ever bought a house where you had to pay, oh my goodness, 8, 9, 10% interest. But I digress. But what happened was,
I had.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Alan, my interest in my house, my very first house was 12%, and that was an FMHA loan.
So you even
well, it's a whole other thing. I did.
Yeah. Well, and I had a friend that a colleague that I worked with when he moved to Oskaloosa, Iowa, which is where I was working at that time. He and his family bought a house, and their interest was 19%. Oh. This was 1981.
Yeah.
So the interest you say was low at around 7%, but it spiked up into the low 20s eventually.
Yeah.
During that time.
And while the 80s farm crisis happened real slowly, one day we woke up and grain was half the price it was a couple years ago, and interest was over double. And you don't need a spreadsheet to figure out what's going to happen with that.
So what happened that made that drastic change?
Well, we had huge overproduction of grain, and we had some pretty good years, which caused that. But the terminology was fence row to fence row, and we just didn't have the population and the demand to do fence row to fence row farming. We did through the Russian wheat deal, but we just couldn't maintain that. But the other thing that happened that really hurt us in the 80s is you had high interest, low grain prices, but if you incurred any debt, i.e. farmland, your farmland went in half in value very quickly also. I don't know whether any of you guys remember Chapter 12, bankruptcy.
Right.
Nobody talks about Chapter 12, but Chapter 12 was just a resetting of the values for the banks. And we had a number of customers that went into Chapter 12, and that was the wherewithal, but we went down to Chapter 7 real quick.
So you mentioned some of the factors, the falling land value. So you bought high price land when things were good. The land devalued. The interest rates started to skyrocket. Prices for commodities or grains, halved, become much less than they were. Increased farm debt. I mean, you're building a scenario that there wasn't much of a way out of it, with all of these factors, and then you had, and this is something that I've been remembering and learning and remembering, the deal with Russia and Carter, President Carter, right?
Correct.
He then instituted a grain embargo with Russia.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about the impact of that embargo?
You guys, you're younger than me, Lamar, but Tom, you're just a bit older. Do you remember that perspective? Because you'd have been more of an adult than I would have been when that.
Well, what I remember is, of course, Iowa is not known for wheat. It's known for corn, soybeans, primarily. But I do remember that really sent a shock through the system in the farmers in Iowa. And in fact, I think that was the overnight shot for a lot of people. Is like they in some of the background research we were doing on this conversation, we came across a woman who said our net worth dropped $20,000 in one day, and with that now today in 2025 $20,000 might not seem a lot to people, but in 1979, that was a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
And so it did send a shock for a lot of farmers in Iowa. I'm wondering now. I did not realize that your business was in several states. I think that is really a great insight that you bring, about all of this in different states. Because I in thinking about our conversation, I was wondering is there a difference between how much of a difference? There is always a difference depending on where you live, but how much of a difference was there for the Kansas farmers versus the Iowa farmers in all of this? And I don't know if that's a question we can necessarily answer very definitively, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, Iowa farmers and basically the I states. That's where all the good soil is. That's where the good weather is. That's where everything's good. We live in Kansas, and born and raised in Kansas, love the state. But in Kansas, about every 7 years, it just won't rain. Yeah. And so you go through a period of drought, and even in the good years, rain isn't like it is in the I states. And so what that does for Kansas farmers is we have to be more conservative. When I started farming full time, I would go to these seminars for farmers. And the one thing that they kept saying was, you've got to know your break even. You just have to know your break even. And then they wanted to sell you this thing that predicted profitability and break evens and where you put everything in. Well, there's two things in Kansas that absolutely we have zero control over. And number one, it's rain. Mm-hmm. So our production can go from literally zero to close to what the I states are, at least on soybeans, can't compete on corn. And the market doesn't care what my break even is. And so I'd get so frustrated because you'd go to that, you listen to these speakers, and then the last one would always come and talk about break even. And I would just get very frustrated. But because of the aggressiveness of the I states, because it does rain there and production is much more predictable, they're much more comfortable with more risk. So the I states got hurt much worse than we did, because while we weren't looking for a Russian wheat deal and a grain embargo, we're looking for a drought. But that made us more prepared than in the I states. I had a classmate that married gal, and I'm not sure 100% of the details, but we were at a high school reunion, and I had just started farming full time, and him and me were sitting off in a corner visiting, and he said, "Alan, whatever you do, never ever buy a piece of new equipment ever." And then as we talked more about that, he ended up, I don't know if they lost the farm, but he ended up with his father-in-law's farm, and it didn't work. And so it's personal, but he was back in one of the I states where you can do those things most of the time. You just couldn't do it in the 80s.
Go ahead, Lamar.
Tom, one of the things that also was happening during that time is, so it wasn't just, obviously the farmers were, they'd just been through kind of a economic agriculture boom, if you want to think about it. And then suddenly the floor drops out. And the collateral contact, collateral damage was huge, and we can talk some more about that here in a little bit. But the land banks, the local banks that had these loans on the books, they took an incredible hit as well over time. This morning I was talking to a relative just to kind of get his perspective on what happened. He said, I just sold a load of hogs and sent my wife to the bank with the check to cash it so I could pay my bills. Walked up to the bank just as the banker locked the doors. The bank went out of business right there in front of them, and no one would cash the check. And then whoever bought the bank later could buy back some of these loans, could assume some of those loans, but the interest rate went from that 7%, in this case, to 21%. And it wasn't all the loans, it was just certain loans. And so, you have a farmer in that situation who can't even pay the interest, that those loans incur, can't even get to the principal at all. There's just no way to walk around. It's going to happen. You're going to lose what you've got, and that's what was going on. And people who were lifelong in the farming business, maybe generational type of farms, had nowhere to really turn for a way to take care of these debts. And so the farm sales started happening. Do you all remember the farm sales? I remember going to them, but I don't think appreciate them like I do now, of the impact that this had on people. Not only were they selling off their livestock, they're selling off their equipment, they're selling off their property, but they're also dealing with an incredible amount of feelings of failure and shame, etc.
Yeah. And
so the impact was broad.
And you need to remember that we were all young in the 80s. And when you're in your 20s, 30s, your perspective is completely different on a tragedy that's not yours. And so, unless you're living it, it takes years to look back and really appreciate how bad that really was.
Yeah.
So have we learned anything?
Yeah, good. But
no. Alan says no.
I think one of the things that as I've been looking, doing this backward glance, because I made it, although I grew up on a farm, I made the decision not to stay on the farm, and so I didn't have quite the same perspective that a lot of my friends did, where I grew up in rural Iowa, that stayed on the farm in terms of what was happening. But in kind of doing this backward look and in thinking about this podcast, I ran across some things that I know were happening, but I didn't realize they were happening at the level that they were happening. Like in Iowa, for example, at one point there were 250 bankruptcies a day with farmers. By the end of the farm crisis, Iowa had lost fully 2/3 of all the farms it had in the 1930s. Farmers were committing suicide. Farmers were losing it and committing murder. They would shoot. Lamar and I were talking that we remember one very clearly that happened south of Iowa City, where a man walked into a bank, shot his banker, and shot his family, and shot himself, and actually shot another farmer. I mean, it was, and farm families were starving, even though they produced the food for the rest of the country, and that is something that I don't think the rest of the country appreciated very, very much at all, because they were kind of shielded from it. And also farmers that I grew up with were very good about not talking about any problems they were having, in part because the fear of shame that Lamar referred to, and that sense of failure that they were experiencing. So they didn't really let people know how much they were really suffering. And that changed only when there really began some activism. And of course, who do we have to thank for some of that activism? Willie Nelson, right?
Yeah. The farm aid,
and some of those things, right? So, yeah, I think it was what is impressed upon me, and so much I think I blocked some of this actually, because I did see it happening to some of my extended family. I saw it happening to people that I knew. And I think that I actually did block a little bit of this. But so going back and looking at it, it was a devastating time. It was just absolutely devastating.
So this conversation was piqued, kind of came out of a conversation Tom and I were having in another podcast you were listening to about tariffs and the impact that might have on farms, farming, etc. And if we're okay, I'd like to segue into maybe what's going on now.
Sure.
And I'll be honest with you, I don't feel like I have a good perspective. And that's, Alan, which I know you do. Can you kind of give us your perspective on kind of what are the challenges that's facing the agriculture now? What's going on now?
Well, our biggest challenge right now is China. And I don't even want to say that, because everything is about China, whether it's good, bad, or ugly.
Sure.
But we had two things happen to us in the past 20 years that have really, really changed our profitability. First and foremost is ethanol. I'm not quite sure where we are today, but if you look at it on average, about 1/3 of our corn goes to ethanol. That's a created market that we never had, that has created a tremendous amount of demand. The second thing that happened was Barack Obama. And he took a lot of heat for it, but he said we live in a global society, and we started some trade with China mostly, both corn and soybeans, that created phenomenal exports. So between ethanol and exports, domestic use, they had to bid up. And we went through some really, really good times. But farming is a three-legged stool, and if you take one of those legs out, then things get pretty wobbly. And we still have our ethanol As a matter of fact, the ethanol business is quite healthy today. Probably half the corn we produce goes to ethanol. But right now, exports aren't good.
What happened to the export? Because as you say,
Well,
China. Can you put
well,
it
first
together?
of all, we have some competition we didn't used to have. We didn't used to have any competition from South America, but they have learned to farm very, very well. And their domestic use is very, very small. So the bulk of South American production is export. So we've got a competitor out there that we didn't have 25 years ago. But as soon as the first Trump administration came in, China decided that they were going to buy their products from anybody but us. And it showed. It showed in the prices. The interesting thing about that nobody talks about is there were tariffs put on China that didn't catch the news like they did now. But I read somewhere, and I don't know where, and I don't know how factual it is. But what I do know is we got a ton of money from the federal government to subsidize for the price differences during the Trump administration. As a matter of fact, I had a gentleman from back east that was visiting with me about a whole different deal, and he immediately said, "So, how much Trump money have you got?" This would have been in like 2018. Well, Kansas is a red state. Nobody talked about it like that. We were just getting money from the federal government. And I thought that's an interesting perspective that he calls it Trump money. And so then during the Biden administration, if you look at the charts, we softened some of our stances, exports improved. And you got to remember there's a lot of other things. There's production, there's fundamentals, there's production in South America. But grain prices actually went up quite nicely. Part of it was because of Biden's climate initiative, gas went up. And so as soon as gas gets close to $4 a gallon, I'm happy as a clam because corn goes up with it. My friends are
and that's because of the ethanol production, right?
Correct. Yeah, they actually run somewhat parallel. And and so, but then, we had a lot of other factors. Exports started to fail, and production went up, and gas prices came down, and we started on a downward trend on grain prices, and we're still there. I think we're going to be there for not just the near future, but for quite a while. Nobody knows. I would expect that we will get some sizable payments from the federal government.
What kind of effect did all of this tariff talk between the U.S. and China, or Trump and China, have on farmers? And I realize this all happened fairly recently, so it may not be far enough out to see a strong effect. But what was happening for farmers while everybody, Trump would raise the tariff to 135%, and China would counter with 145%. What was happening then for farmers?
Well, everything moves fairly slow in the ag world.
Right.
And so the biggest problem is the unpredictability, and no markets like unpredictability. So you can just shave some off your market when you're in an unpredictable thing like that. The other thing is that as soon as tariffs get over 60, 70%, we can talk numbers, but essentially no trade happens at those levels. But if you look at the export report, you will always see some trades that we do that are to unknown destinations. And what that probably means is that we sold the grain to another company and it ended up in China.
Right.
But it takes care
there
of
was
their
a middleman
caveat.
somewhere, right?
Yeah, we didn't buy it from the United States, and so it's a numbers game, verbiage game.
Yeah.
But right now, wheat's as low as it's been in decades. Corn and beans are low, but they're actually higher than with the environment we're in than I thought they would be. But it's hard to plan. You don't know when to make the sale.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know whether to sell ahead, or it's just really hard to manage.
And is part of that because we don't know what's coming next internationally in our relations?
Correct.
Is that part of why it's hard to plan?
Yeah, it's really hard to plan, especially on the soybean market. But I don't know whether you guys have heard that a rising tide floats all ships. Have you heard that?
I have heard that, yeah.
Okay, because I got a whole slew of little sayings like that. So if you want an explanation, just stop me, because I got a bucket full. But and this is just Allen, this has no factual basis. But the one thing that we need from China is cheaper production of goods. We don't have the labor to do it. We don't have the ability to do it. We can talk what we want, but that type of manufacturing isn't going to return to the United States. It might go to someplace else other than China. And the truth is, China is actually fairly self-sufficient. They really don't need a lot from us, but they can't get anywhere close to producing food for all those people. And so my hope is that we would come up with a trade deal where, okay, we'll back off on the tariffs and we'll buy your stuff, but you got to buy your soybeans from us. Well, if they'd make a deal like that, we could put $2 on soybeans and $1 on corn in 2 weeks. But every deal, we all get excited for a day or two, and then we kind of wonder what's going to happen next. And nothing's permanent.
If we were to kind of take our conversation about 1980s, the farm crisis, the things that happened, and let's take a look at today. You know, the amount of debt that was incurred, the type of debt that was incurred, the availability of loans, the dependency on programs. Where do you think we are? What kind of risk are we living with in the agricultural world, based off of some of those factors?
I think the general farm community is much less leveraged than they were in the 80s. I think we're solider, but we've had poor enough conditions that there's quite a bit of stress in the farm community. I've heard of people that are struggling getting operating capital. I've heard of some people that have been denied, and those stories didn't exist 3 years ago.
Allen, one of the things that I know happened in the 80s in Iowa is that there were some outside groups that came in and offered private funding to farmers. And of course, then when the farmers couldn't survive, they would take over their farms and they'd, resell them. And we also saw some farmers that were local very much, but they were in a better position. So as people began to go bankrupt and the farm sales had come on, they would start buying up more land and becoming much, much larger. Are we still seeing some of that kind of investment from outside in Kansas and in Iowa and various other places that are known for farming, or has that kind of hit a plateau?
I think that's always been there. But we wouldn't see the kind of activity that you'd see in Iowa.
Really? Why is that?
Because it doesn't rain. It just forgets to rain. So while Iowa is a much more expensive investment, it's much easier to move down the road and predict what's going to happen. That said, there's investors. Our farm has an investor, and he grew up on a farm, and it's all private money. It's not business, but he sees value in putting some of his assets into farm ground.
Allen, a while back, you said that farming is a three-legged stool. And I am always fascinated by three-legged stools. I think of those in various contexts, all right? And I'm curious to know, what do you see as the three legs of a farm?
Well, actually there's way more than three legs. But
right.
But the
you
big
may
leg,
have to condense them.
The big leg for a Kansas farmer is rain production. Those are all one. That's one leg. And the second big leg is market prices, and the third is interest. So let me just give you an example of interest. When interest got real cheap, you could actually buy a new piece of equipment, finance it, and run it cheaper than an old piece of equipment, because your interest was actually quite a bit less than even just repairs on equipment, let alone anything else. Well, that ship has sailed. Even that doesn't work at today's interest rates. But when we got into the twos, your numbers just change. And so as those change, you've got to change with it.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, that you just alluded to a few minutes ago when we were talking about China, it seems to me that even if American administrations really don't want to participate in the world as a whole, it's talking about a ship that has sailed. We can't avoid globalization because so much of our own economy really depends upon it. Is that a fair statement? Or for those folks that really want to set the United States off as its own little island here and bring all the manufacturing back and all of that back, is that actually possible? Or do we not need these relationships with other countries and the markets in other countries?
Absolutely, that's a fair statement, with one caveat. And I'm going to jump ahead here. Sorry.
Okay.
But SAF would actually make us semi-sustainable nationalistically. Are you guys familiar with
what
SAF?
What is SAF?
That's sustainable air fuel. And I find it really interesting, but you can run a jet on pure soybean oil, canola oil, any oil, with no modifications to the jet and not a lot of modifications to the oil. And the biggest carbon footprint that we're struggling with today that isn't being addressed is airlines. There's a lot of planes in the sky burning a lot of fuel on a daily basis. And if we could do that, this is just the math, but if you would take and say today, we're going to do 100% SAF, it would take every acre in the United States to soybeans, and that would take care of 100% of the oil.
Wow.
That's a game changer. But there's the backside of that, because you have soybean oil, then what do you do with all that soybean meal? And we don't have enough places for that. So It's a really nice, fun statement for some farmer to say, man, if we could do that, soybeans would be $15, but it doesn't really work that way in the real world.
So in the next few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about how you are approaching farming with your son, Allen. And you're going to use a couple of terms that people may not quite understand. And so could you tell us first, what are biologicals? What you mean when you talk about biologicals? And then also explain to us briefly the concept of carbon offsets.
Sure. Biologicals is a huge market, and there are lots of them. And if you look at the ads, they all pay for themselves. And so if you could get synergy from biologicals, we could put probably 30 of them on and raise 500 bushel corn, and all our problems would be solved. But that's not really the way it works. You either coat the seed or you spray it on the plant, and it actually takes care of some of the things that are missing there. But they aren't chemicals. They're all natural. And they all have different modes of action. The biological that we use, and this is the hard part about biologicals, but the biologicals that we use basically buy us in a dry spell about 2 weeks. Our plant health is better. Hard example, we live on a blacktop. We go to a church that probably 1.5 generations ago was mostly farmers. Today there are 2 farmers in church, and it's myself and my son. And so everybody, if you grew up on a farm or grandpa was on a farm, they all have interest. And we were in a drought, and I found it really interesting that people would stop me at church and say, hey, why is your corn greener than everybody else's? And I thought that our corn was greener than everybody else's, but I'm also a glass half full person, and I got to check myself at the door. And farmers don't talk a lot. We don't share as much as we should. We could help each other, but we're also in competition with each other because we're going to grab that next quarter of ground that we can rent away from somebody because somebody else was farming it. But that corn was a full 10 bushel better than any corn in the area. And I attribute that to the biological, because the neighbors that I did get information on, they're as good a farmers as we are, but they aren't using that biological. So that's the biological.
So a biological is basically it's a natural substance that you're putting on the corn or on the crop to help it grow better. Okay. So the biological I remember us using as a kid was manure. I guess it's kind of a biological. Is that a biological?
What's interesting is you asked about the carbon, and if you go to a practice change carbon program, manure is actually one of your higher rated practices.
Oh really?
Yeah.
For carbon exchange?
For carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
Not necessarily exchange, but sequestration. Okay. So the highest is cover crops. The second highest is no-till. And manure is number 3. So
wow.
You nailed it, Tom.
Oh yeah. Well, I could if I think really hard about it, I can still recall the smell.
And Tom, that's quite a compliment, just so you know.
Well, it is.
Yes.
I'm honored. I'm honored. Well, thank you, Allen. I really appreciate that. That will certainly help folks grasp a little bit better that part of the conversation a few minutes ago. So
your second part of the question was carbon offsets.
Yes.
And as we've been in the carbon business, everybody, as you approach somebody, immediately says, this is government. And the truth is, it's not. It's all private money. The government part of that is if you can't meet some of your standards, and it's cheaper to buy a carbon offset than it is to retrofit your plant, you're buying carbon offsets. But the exchange is all private money. And there is an exchange, and carbon goes for so much a ton, and you know how many tons you're emitting. And so it's just math. Google search, they've changed their bottom line now, but a year or two ago, it would say carbon neutral since 2007 they're on the bottom line. Well, they have no ability to be carbon neutral. They buy electricity, they hire people, they have a footprint. So they were buying offsets.
Okay. That's helpful. So the offset is a way for a company that really struggles to be carbon neutral to achieve some at least appearance of carbon neutrality. They may buy the carbon offset from the farmer or from someone else that has those available. Am I getting that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
We're really struggling here in the United States trying to figure out how we're going to do this. Europe is way ahead of us. They're running a lot of carbon neutral areas in Europe, and their model is so different. We can't just overlay it on our model, but we're working at it.
Interesting. That's really helpful, Alan. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about what you and Paul and Silver Creek Farms are doing, and kind of getting into this.
Okay, so Paul
in this
came
line
back to the
of
farm in 2017.
Fuel, yeah,
and he was working for Agco, which is our local machinery, and he had worked himself up quite fast. I was very proud of him, but there were some major changes going on there, and he was already part of the farm, but I could tell that he wanted to come back to the farm, and he was ready to. And the farm was fine at that point to take him back, but with the uncertainty, I felt like we needed to diversify, and we had an opportunity to get into a Scope 1 carbon program. And so with Paul coming back full time, plus the opportunity, we jumped at that. That was a program with Locus Ag where they paid you $12 an acre. You signed a 4-year contract, and you had to, in order to qualify for carbon, and we could have a 5-hour podcast on this, but I'll try and make it short. You have to have a practice change. And they had a biological that they had approval as a practice change. So you bought a $5 biological, you got 12. And the biological helps production. To what extent, that depends on the weather and a lot of other factors. But we signed up a bunch of people, and that was a really nice business. The problem is that the way that business was platformed was when that was really platformed on the price of carbon. And the price of carbon hasn't moved in the last 4 years. And so right now there's some restructuring going on in that. So in the meantime, we got into another business with Scope 3 carbon. And Scope 1 is a carbon offset, and that is pure carbon. So they do soil samples, figure out how much carbon you have, figure out how much carbon you sequestered, and they sell it on the carbon market. Scope 3 is a carbon inset. And so what that is if, and I'm not sure, I'm going to make some, you guys might be not where the rest of the people I run around with, but if you put a bottle of ketchup on the shelf and it's $5, and you put another one beside it that says sustainably sourced and it's $8, The younger group in the United States will grab the $8 one. They like sustainably sourced stuff. Myself, I'm buying the $5 one, and I don't even look at the label. So, but that's what the carbon inset thing is about, because what they do is they buy the environmental assets of an acre of ground, and that offsets their carbon footprint, but it's not sold on the carbon market, but it allows them to say sustainably sourced. And so those are the two markets we're in. We just entered another market that actually has more excitement, and it's a pasture program where we're able to make some practice changes on practice. And the people that are buying the carbon offsets, this is scope one again, are more interested in permanence, but they want it from the ag market. Well, pastures, I've sequestered a bunch of carbon in the last 5 years through my locust program, but that doesn't mean I don't go broke tomorrow and somebody doesn't come in and rip it up at 12 inches deep and release all the carbon we sequestered back in the atmosphere. We no-till, and so it's not going anywhere. But that it's not permanent. But the pastures aren't going to be broke out. All the pastures that are breakoutable, if that's a word, have probably been broken out. And so we're working on that now. And so what that did is that diversified us, and that allowed us to be comfortable with Paul coming back, and he's taken the lead on that. And I'm living a dream. I'm 70 years old and watching my son flourish. He called me yesterday, and he was very excited. We rolled up about 100,000 acres of pasture ground into our new program yesterday.
Wow.
And hats off to him, because I didn't have a lot to do with it. I'd like to say I did, but I didn't.
Alan, it appears that, so full disclosure, a year or so ago, I had the opportunity to help you out during harvest and run one of your trucks. Haul some corn, soybean, and I think maybe even one load of wheat back then. But one of the things that I heard from you over and over, and I get a sense from what you're working at intentionally, is you have a desire, you're highly motivated to increase the health or better the health of your soil and the processes you use. That seems to be something you talk about a lot, or you spend a lot of attention. How do I make this process better and healthier? Would that make sense to you? Am I getting that right?
Well, absolutely. Our philosophy on our farm is we want to leave the soil, when it goes on to whoever's next, in much better condition than we got it. And you have two choices when you farm. Well, you actually have more than that, but you can mine the soil and you just deplete it. We've picked up some new ground that we went in and did soil sampling, and the pHs were in the 4s and the phosphoruses were in the single digits. And what that meant was they were removing more from the soil than what they were putting back. And so they were mining the soil. So you've got to look at removal. You got to look at replacement. We live in an area that is a very, very high potassium soils, and nobody ever even looked at replacing potassium. But we've been putting potassium back on now for about the last 5 to 10 years. And so there's lots of that. We no-till. There's a lot of reasons to no-till. There's a lot of reasons not to. But the biggest reason to no-till in Kansas is wind erosion. And we forgot, because the bulk of our area either does minimum till or no-till. And we forgot what it was like to have our ground worked and stuff to blow, until the neighbor across the road decided to put in alfalfa, and he worked the ground real fine. And we got some horrendous winds. and he was south of Heston, and people were actually talking about it in Heston. What is going on? We haven't ever seen this. Well, yes, we used to see it. We've all forgotten. So
I believe that I had to wash off my deck after that windstorm.
yeah, you would have got caught in that, Lamar.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think that's, first of all, very admirable, but it's fascinating to me, the shift in thinking of what we take away from the soil that produces our food and our crops, and rethink about how do we make it better than when we started with it. And I'm not sure that's a story that is often told about the agricultural business, but I think it's an important story. And I wanted to make sure we had a chance to just mention that, if nothing else.
Yeah, I don't think we're alone with that. I would say that I would hope over 50% of my colleagues that farm are probably in the same boat. And you can kind of just tell by driving by.
Yes. Okay. Well, we have now reached the 1 hour mark of our conversation. And Alan, I know when you started out, you had no idea where this was going to go. We don't always either. But I got to tell you how much we have appreciated this opportunity to dig into history, to dig into what's going on currently, and kind of where the future is in agriculture. So I very much appreciate the time you spent with us.
Yeah, likewise, Alan. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. And actually, Lamar's probably told you that we're headed to Kansas later this year, and I hope for the opportunity to sit down and have coffee with you. And I think you invited me to come on out to the farm or experience farming while I'm not sure you want me trying to actually farm anything, Alan. I just want to say I'm not a great farmer.
Well, not even.
I do. What's that?
You're not even welcome to try anything. Because
oh, good.
It's all computers and buttons, and you're just going to mess it all up. But I think that Lamar told me that you're coming in September. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah,
because in September it's dryland corn harvest, and hopefully we get some rain, so it's decent corn. But I will do the coffee. But I really, really want you to spend a half a day with us. And Lamar doesn't know this yet, but we traded trucks, and it has his name on it, and he's going to haul more than 1 or 2 loads. So there you go.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Actually, it really does.
Let me tell you a little bit about how the level of expertise. So I drove truck during harvest, I had a great time. And I remember one morning, Alan comes out and says, "You have just graduated." What he meant to tell me was I was going to drive a truck that had double trailers on it. In my mind, I'm saying, do I get to drive that combine over there? And Alan's response was, "No, that's graduate school. You're not there."
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This has been great. It's been a tremendous opportunity to meet you and to learn from you.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
All right. You bet. Well, thank you.
All right. Hopefully we'll get you back sometime here, Alan. So.
Sure.
Okay. There we go. We got a commitment.
Well, that was really interesting, Tom. I'm so glad we had Alan join us and give us a bit of an education on farming now and some of the challenges and the opportunities that he's facing, as well as this opportunity to go and talk about our what happened back in the 80s and how that's impacted farming. And all of that has been, I think, a really good conversation to have. But a little bit difficult sometimes.
Yes. I really enjoyed meeting Alan, and of course I've only come to know him through you, and I just was so impressed with the conversation that we were able to have with him, and I learned a lot from him, and just am so appreciative of his willingness to talk with us about these things, to give us occasional feedback on the podcast.
Right.
And just in terms of the forward view, I appreciate so much what he and his son Paul are doing around
Mm-hmm.
sustainable farming and trying to care for the land in the way that they do. I think that's just really, really neat. Very
I think
nice.
some of our listeners may need to do what we do, and that's get on and do a little bit of Google search to try to understand even some of, particularly when it comes to the carbon farming that he and Paul are doing some work in. But I do have to tell you, the time that I have helped Alan out, I have been fascinated and impressed to see the level of care that Alan and Paul and many other farmers, I'm sure, give to trying to sustain, the world that they're working in.
Yeah,
and that, I don't think that is given enough airtime, to be honest with you.
yeah. No, I agree. I got to tell you that I was just fascinated to hear him talk about soybean oil powered airplanes.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like, well, I don't know if I'm ever going to fly again, number one, but how interesting to get into an airplane that is powered by soybean oil.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by that. I mean, who knew? Well,
Who knew?
Alan knew. Alan knew, but
And am I spilling jet fuel or am I smelling French fries? Sure. I'm sorry, that was a bad joke.
Or maybe tofu.
Yeah, but no, it is fascinating, and I think that's just one slice of the kinds of opportunities that are out there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Tom, I'm curious to know a little bit about your experience here. There was some unintended consequences for me in this whole preparation time. I went back and tried to understand the farm crisis. I would have been young, just married, in the 80s, and my family did have. I had a family member who lost his farm during the 80s because of the crisis, and the things that we've talked about impacted my family, in particular my family member greatly. But also just seeing and hearing from the people in a video that we watched, and I would encourage people to watch this, an hour and a half long. It's Iowa Public Broadcasting Service. It was done in, I think, 2013. And it's basically the 1980s farm crisis is, I think, the title. It's worth watching. But several things that you remember the rallies that were happening with farmers who were going to rallies. And,
yes.
And I knew farmers who went to those rallies.
Yeah.
And young farmers, old farmers. But one of the things they said was that was really only about 2% of the farmers ever attended those rallies.
Yeah, that was shocking.
Most of them had no outlet or no support system in place for what they were going through.
And that became obvious in other ways because there were a lot of suicides by Iowa farmers because they lost their farms. I mean, they when the prices collapsed and their debts and the interest rates went up, prices collapsed, and they were trying to service a lot of debt. And the anxiety and the frustration and the worry and the sense of shame and failure that so many farmers felt drove many to commit suicide or other acts of violence. Right. And I do remember those. I'm a little bit older than you, and I had in the 1980s I was pretty well ensconced in my first career, which really took me a lot into rural Iowa and interacting with farm families. And one of the things that hit me as I was watching that video from Iowa Public Television was that I was not as conscious of what was happening as what I could have been, because I was around so many farm families. I mean, every place I went was in rural Iowa, and every place I worked was in rural Iowa. And I didn't see it, and I kicked myself. But then as I watched the film, I also understood in a different way how the crisis was many times kept hidden by the farmers themselves.
Right.
That the families were proud. Some of them were managing legacy farms that were over 100 years old in their families, and they were on the brink of losing them, and they didn't. They felt ashamed, they felt scared, they felt failure, and they just didn't want anybody to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I understand why I didn't see it as clearly as I did, but I wish I had. Because the people that did see it, they stepped up and they provided some care and some help that I could have been able to do at that same time.
Yeah.
So it was a real revelation for me to watch that and to realize what I didn't see, even though in my own family, I know that I come from a family of farmers as well, that people struggled and farmers were lost.
I think one of the questions that I had for Allen that he answered very quickly was, I said, did we learn anything? And he said, no. And I think that, I remember the housing market that went bust. How many years ago was that? 08 or whenever that was.
Right.
Similar kinds of things, overextending credit, loaning to the point of being upside down on value, and people losing their homes, etc. Similar kinds of situation economically, not totally, but same kind of situation people were finding themselves in, and lenders were being a part of. And so the concern is, do we find ourselves in a similar situation now in the agriculture world? Hopefully not. But there is a lot of debt, I know, out in the agriculture community. So just some random thoughts that I've had.
Yeah, and I think the concern that kind of pushed us to think about doing this podcast is that with seeing what's been going on with the tariffs, and how that is affecting the markets for farmers and others, is that kind of impact or that kind of effect possible again?
And something that Allen said that I think bears just kind of thinking about is that the government in the past has found ways to provide financial resources back to the farmers.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a guarantee.
Yes.
And that's an important thing for us to remember. If the agriculture community is saying, "Oh, well, we'll get the funds one way or another, recoup those funds one way or another," because we have in the past. With this administration, I don't think I would bet on anything being a guarantee.
Yeah. I agree. I think the thing that we have learned in the last few months is that there are no guarantees. About what could or possibly could happen. Yeah.
Well, I will say you and I guarantee a good time every time we get together. So I've enjoyed this chance to talk with you and chance to talk with Allen. So so we wrap it up.
And I get to meet Allen.
Yeah, you do. When you come to Kansas here this year, you get it. He's invited you out to the farm.
Yes, but he's already told me that I can't operate any equipment.
Yeah, well,
that's
I understand why.
That's a very smart move on his part.
That's not about you, by the way. That's about the level of technology in the equipment.
He's one smart guy. He and Paul got to be a couple of really smart guys to do what they're doing, and I promise not to touch any buttons when I'm there.
Okay.
So, all right, good to see you, Lamar.
All right, later on.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tom here. Thank you for listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Remember to click on subscribe to get notices about new episodes, and be sure to like and share the podcast as well. Opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are solely those of Lamar Roth and Tom Klaus, and we'd like to hear your opinions and ideas too. You can leave us a voice message on Spotify, or you can email us at the addresses found in the show notes. Also, in the show notes, you can find links to some of the things we talked about today, so you can check them out yourself. Until next time, keep moving forward toward third space.
This program was produced with way too much Colombian coffee.